to Facebook Live. All these take a couple steps.
Susan, you are awesome. You're absolutely awesome.
Oh, thank you. And I did allow you guys to unmute yourself, and it just makes it a little easier when we get to the cafe at the end that you can unmute yourself. So we are preparing to stream, and we are live on Facebook. All right. So TJ Woodward is an inspirational speaker, educator, and author. Oh, I'm not quite live. Sorry. And TJ, what was your talk title?
Awakening a Greater Reality.
Ooh, awakening in a greater reality. That's exciting. Okay, now we're going live. So he is an inspirational speaker, educator, and author. He is the founder of Conscious Recovery Method, which is a groundbreaking addiction and treatment method. He is one of the founding ministers at Agape Bay Area in Oakland. He is an ordained Agape minister, a graduate of the Spiritual Development Program and Leadership Development Program at Unity Institute. So I'm happy to introduce to you TJ Woodward.
Thank you so much. So honored to be here. Happy Easter, everyone who's here on Zoom with us and everyone on Facebook Live. So incredibly grateful. I always like to start with gratitude. And actually, I impromptu, in a really impromptu way, chose a reading. So I'm going to invite us to contemplate the reading. We're going to do a brief meditation, and then I'll begin the talk. So for this, I will use my glasses because these are a powerful spiritual tool that allows us to have sight. So this is from the book, Birthing a Greater Reality. Robert Brummett, who is, or was, I'm not sure if he still is, a teacher at Unity Institute. And I absolutely love this book. It's one of my favorite books, and it speaks so beautifully to awakening a greater reality. Ultimately, our deepest desire is to experience the one, which is also our own essential nature. But when our essential nature has been repressed and lost to conscious awareness, it will be projected externally onto something or someone in our world. Like a mirage in the desert, the external appearance can seem very real. And like the thirsty traveler, we may journey a long way only to discover this mirage cannot satisfy us. So with that, I invite us to take a moment and move within as we contemplate the deep desire to connect with the one power, the one presence that is our essential nature, our beingness. So just taking a nice deep conscious breath. And on the exhale, we simply allow ourselves to become open, tuning into the frequency of gratitude for our time together, gratitude for this moment. And as we allow ourselves to move into this time of contemplation, of silence, we simply open up to the infinite possibilities of our time together. And so I invite us now, if you haven't already, to gently close your eyes and move within as we take 2 minutes together in the silence. And how grateful I am to know that there is one power, one presence, the ever unfolding source energy that is my life, and it is the life of each and every one of us. So we know this morning that our time together is blessed as we explore the Easter story from a mystical perspective. So we simply open up now to the infinite possibilities, knowing in the realm of spirit it is already done. So with great gratitude, we release this, we let it go, we let it be, and so it is. So I am deeply honored to share with you at Unity of Stockton this morning, and for everyone watching and tuning in, happy Easter. What I'm going to be exploring today, the topic is awakening a greater reality. And interpreting or exploring the Easter story through a mystical lens. So I actually want to start with what I mean by a mystical lens. In my first book, Conscious Being, I created, and I'm going to say created because I have a very interesting story about that. The very first time I ever spoke at a New Thought Center, I don't even know what year, maybe 2006. My talk was called Beyond Metaphysics. And I was talking about how we as a people, as a consciousness, are evolving beyond simply the metaphysical interpretation of life and moving into the mystical. And after that talk, someone came up to me and said, wow, that sounds so similar to what Michael Beckwith has written about. You might want to check it out. And I thought, well, that's very interesting. And then I wrote my book and I laid out these 4 levels of consciousness. And lo and behold, I find out that he has created almost the exact same framework. So it's actually no surprise that we now have collaborated a few times and I've been enfolded into the agape movement. And the reason I start with that is a recognition that as we spend time in the silence, we actually tap into the collective and the eternal consciousness, ultimate consciousness, and we gather information or we have insights from that place that we might not have been able to do through our mind. Why am I starting with this? I'm starting with this because I want to explore these 4 levels as a framework or a foundation for how we would interpret any story through the mystical lens. So in these 4 levels of conscious awareness in my book, I have called them 4 different things starting with the letter M, because my mind likes really simple. So I like to grab onto things that really make sense and that I can really comprehend. So these 4 levels, I'm going to give a brief overview, and then we're going to move into the Easter story and how we might view the story through these different levels of conscious awareness. And I do want to say, before I even dive into that, that when we talk about levels of consciousness or levels of conscious awareness, it might sound like we're talking about high and low or good and bad or evolved and not evolved. And that's not really the intention. The intention of this is for us to take a look within to ask ourselves, which level am I currently tuned into and radiating from? And therefore, how am I experiencing that in my life? That's why I love that reading from Robert Brumet, because he says if we're not aware, if we don't have conscious awareness, the unconscious is actually dictating what we call reality, and it's creating our life. And many of us might not even be aware that this is happening. So I want to be clear, I'm not saying we graduate to these different levels and therefore we're better than someone or less than someone. We're really exploring it as a possibility for each of us as a moment to moment choice and awareness. So we're not comparing ourselves to someone else, or we're not even really comparing ourselves to where we were at a week ago, a day ago, a month ago, or a year ago. We're recognizing that there is a choice that each of us has every single moment of where we want to be tuning into and living from. And that to me is true freedom, because we begin to move our life from unconscious creation to conscious creation. And then we can start to shift the stories, the narratives, and what we have called reality, and start to birth this greater reality or awaken to this greater reality. So these 4 levels that I've given M's for names: level 1, martyr. Another word for this is victim consciousness. And I just want to be really transparent. I lived in this level of consciousness for many, many years. I believed the world was happening to me. I believed there was something wrong with me. I believed there was something wrong with the world. And therefore, I kept experiencing the brokenness of the world. So, level one, martyr. Things happen to me. I'm a victim to the world, and I believe that I must change the world in order to be free. And then through spiritual practice in my own journey, I came into New Thought in 1988, and I heard these profound ideas that we can actually change our reality based on our thought. So I moved into what I now call magical thinking level. And that level is centered in the mind. It's centered in changing our thoughts and therefore changing our life. Now, I lived in this level of consciousness for many, many years. And I want to be clear again, at any moment, we can tap into any of these levels. And in my experience, we are living primarily at one of these levels. So I was primarily living in the victim martyr consciousness. The world is happening to me. That is centered in physical. What I could see is what I called reality. What I could see and hear and touch, that was reality to me. And then as I came into New Thought and I started to discover that through affirmations and through prayer and through affirmative prayer and meditation, I could start to change my mind and therefore change what I called reality. I started doing the vision boards, which was very exciting because I didn't realize that I could actually impact the conditions of my life and therefore the conditions of how I perceive the world. So moving into that I now call magical thinking really did feel like magic. And then as I continued my evolution, my spiritual practice, my curiosity, I became aware of another level of consciousness that I call metaphysical. And that is things happen through me. So level one, things happen to me. Level two, I make things happen. Level three, I allow things happen or things happen through me. This is where we start talking about channeling, or we start talking about something or someone talking through us. The word through comes into this. This point of view or perspective moves us into our heart space. So from physical to mental, and then tapping into emotions. This is where we might still use some external tools like tarot cards or runes or even the latest book or another workshop, which of course is incredibly useful. And that metaphysical level is one that a great deal of New Thought has lived in. As a matter of fact, many New Thought centers call them metaphysical churches or metaphysical spiritual centers. And what I want to share about that in a moment is my experience of doing my education, 5 years of schooling at Unity Institute, and how I discovered this other level. And this other level, of course, is within each and every one of us. And that is the mystical level. And that is things happen as me. So level one, things happen to me. Level two, I make things happen. Level three, I allow things to happen or things happen through me. And then ultimately at the mystical level, things happen as me. So I started with that because a lot of times in Unity and other New Thought centers, we tend to talk about the metaphysical interpretation of story. And I have heard many beautiful and very powerful metaphysical interpretations of the Easter story, for example. And when I was in school, a lot of the education was centered around what did Charles Fillmore say about that. And if you're not familiar with who Charles Fillmore is, he and his wife Myrtle Fillmore were the founders of Unity, and they ushered in a profound new consciousness that was happening around the world. And again, they tapped into this evolution of consciousness where they started to recognize that I can actually affect what I call reality. I can heal myself. I can use thoughts to change my reality. It was profound at the time. And of course, Charles Fillmore wrote the Metaphysical Bible Dictionary, where he went through and gave his interpretation of all the different terms that we would read in the Christian text. This was really incredible because that was actually his mystical interpretation of the stories. He went within and created from this place deep within him an interpretation that at the time was profound and groundbreaking. Because, see, most of the world has lived in martyr or victim consciousness, and we still see that today. And again, we're not going from good and bad and right and wrong, but we're looking at what does it create when we live in victim martyr. And so if I'm living in victim martyr consciousness, I believe the problem is outside of me. The world is happening to me. I'm a victim to that. And therefore, I'm going to look for a savior outside of me to try to change what's happening in my life. And we can see that a lot of traditional religions live in that paradigm. And so when Charles and Myrtle Fillmore came along, and so many other New Thought teachers and philosophers came along and said, what if we're not a victim to the world? What if through spiritual practice, we can start to change our mind and change what we call reality? What if illness isn't the ultimate truth of who and what we are, that we can actually tap into something within us that has a profound impact or profound effect on our own healing? And so he created this metaphysical Bible dictionary from his own practice. And I'm going to guess that Myrtle had a lot to do with that because her writings are beautiful. She was so beautifully living in this heart-centered metaphysical reality, where in my experience, Charles maybe was a little bit more in that mental, which is very, very powerful. And they're both really important, right? And that's why I think they together created such a profound movement that is unity. But here's what I am noticing, and here's what I did notice when I was in school. I started my education at Unity in 2005, and I think went for about 5 years, 6 years. I ultimately graduated from spiritual leadership in 2011. So my experience of a lot of what was happening at Unity Institute, and I see it in other New Thought centers too, is people were focused on what would Charles Fillmore say. Does that sound familiar? What would Jesus say, people say, or what would Charles Fillmore say? And the interesting thing about that is, in my experience, when we only look for what someone outside of us said, even a profound spiritual teacher like Charles and Myrtle Fillmore, we might lose the ability to ask ourselves the profound question, what does this story mean to me? What does this story mean in my own consciousness? What happens when I allow myself to open up to this inner wisdom that will give me information that doesn't come from a book? So what I discovered is people were using the Metaphysical Bible Dictionary, and all we were doing, and honestly, in a lot of the classes, all we were supposed to do is take a story and then look what Charles Fillmore said these different words meant, and then rewrite the story based on what he said. And that's a beautiful experience because what we discovered, what we created then was Charles Fillmore's mystical interpretation of the Easter story. But I remember having the courage, because it did take courage, I think, in some ways, to raise my hand in class and say, but wait a minute. Charles Fillmore and Myrtle Fillmore and New Thought in general is inviting us to look within and to reconnect with our true nature, our essential beingness, God essence, and ask for the information to come from that level of spirit. And yet what we're doing is interpreting the stories through the mind and through the mind of Charles Fillmore. Now, some people were really open to that exploration. And there were a couple of people who called themselves, I think it was Charles Fillmore purists, who said what's important is what he said, and unity is founded in that. So this was really interesting because Paul Hasselbeck, who was, I believe still is, the Dean of Students at Unity Institute, once did a presentation where he put a quote from Charles Fillmore up on the screen and said, look, this is what Charles Fillmore said about this. And then the next slide was another quote from Charles Fillmore 5 years later that seemed to say the opposite. And so what he was pointing to and what I am pointing to is that consciousness is always evolving. And we have pure consciousness or ultimate reality, which is unchanging, what we call spirit or source energy or God essence. If it is true that that is unchanging principle or love energy or God or source, then what changes is our ability to perceive that. So when we start to look at any story, but today, of course, we're going to be looking at the Easter story, the invitation is for us to ask ourselves what it might mean to us. In other words, I'm going to share with you where my current consciousness, my perspective or my perception or my awareness of the Easter story. But what I really want to invite is for each of us to look within and ask ourselves, what does this story mean to me? So, of course, many of it, I didn't actually grow up really hearing the Easter story. It was sort of a distant thing. So, for me, I had to actually learn some of the story. But to give a very, very simple overview of the story, as many of us know, but I'm going to assume that there might be someone watching or listening right now that isn't overly familiar with the story. So, I want to start with last Sunday when we have Palm Sunday, when Jesus rides the donkey into Jerusalem and then ultimately to his crucifixion. And now Charles Fillmore said the interpretation of that Jerusalem was a higher level of consciousness and that the donkey represented peace. So he rode in peace to his higher level of consciousness, or bringing, you could even say, a higher level of conscious awareness through his own evolution and through his own individual awareness of his consciousness. And so what it means to me in this moment is also an awareness, because what happened next, what happened ultimately was that there was the crucifixion on Friday. And the crucifixion, often in New Thought, I have heard it say the crucifixion represents crossing out negative thinking. But I intend to take it a little deeper today. And that is, if this is a story that I begin to ask myself, what does this story mean to me as a representation of the evolution of consciousness? I would say, am I peacefully willing to take a look at those parts of myself that may no longer serve me or the world? In other words, am I willing to look at those nooks and crannies, if you will, or what we might call the shadow, those parts of myself I buried, maybe those parts of myself that I'm ashamed of or that I don't really want anyone else to see? And so what we could say with this story is it's possible for us to ignore that. In other words, not go to the city, or it's possible for us to resist that, to pretend that that's not true. And then, as the reading said, then we end up projecting it onto everyone else. In other words, I see all the flaws in someone else and maybe haven't taken a moment to take a look at what is happening within me. And I don't tend to look at things through the lens of good and bad or right and wrong. So even the idea of a flaw is only in relative reality. And so is it possible for me to move into conscious awareness, the evolution of my consciousness, raising my consciousness to a higher level in my experience does involve a crucifixion? And I do think sometimes in New Thought, we tend to focus on the love and the light and the transformation and all the goodness in the world. And that's so important. And I also know in my own evolution of my own consciousness that I needed to take a look at some of those aspects of self that I had buried, that I was ashamed of, that I didn't want anyone to see, that at one point in my level of consciousness, I would have called it as part of my defect or something that was wrong with me. I've come to understand that we're moving into a new level of conscious awareness now. We've heard that we are spiritual beings having a human experience. And what I see us shifting into right now is spiritual beings having a spiritual experience. In other words, what if it's all spiritual? What if those parts of myself that I've abandoned, that I called human, are actually deeply spiritual? What if some of the most painful experiences of my life have actually created the greatest transformation? That to me is my own mystical interpretation of the crucifixion story. I will peacefully honor all parts of myself and begin to take a look at how I allow those parts of myself that I have abandoned to come up for healing. And that for me involves allowing myself to feel, having spiritual community, loving and trusting the process, allowing myself to notice those parts of myself that maybe we call the ego, my points of view, my perspective. In other words, the crucifixion to me is really more about questioning everything I've ever believed. If it's true that thoughts create reality, if it's true that my emotional state creates reality, if it's true that the frequency that I'm vibrating from is actually what creates reality, then I can begin to question everything that is not that. In other words, we come into this world as whole and perfect spiritual beings, deeply one with source energy. And then most of us come into a world, in other words, we're born on planet Earth, and we begin to be taught all sorts of ideas of our own lack and limitation and brokenness, not good enough. And I always say, if you didn't have Mr. Rogers as your teacher growing up, you probably did not hear you're whole and perfect just as you are. Many of us come into school systems, family systems where we start to believe that we're broken or somehow not good enough and that we must achieve something in order to be worthy. And now we're saying, what if it's really about exploring all those ideas and those beliefs and allowing ourselves to, yes, crucify, and that's a pretty harsh word. So I will say to question, to become curious, to ask ourselves, is this the ultimate truth of who and what I am? And the even more important question to me, and this is the question I have been living in for at least a year, and it's very, very simple. What gets created when I blank? So, what gets created when I believe I'm broken? What gets created when I understand my true nature as a whole and perfect spiritual being? What gets created when I view the world through good and bad and right and wrong? And what gets created when I view the world with curiosity, openness, and presence? So to me, that crucifixion story is profoundly simple. I begin to look at all the ideas, the beliefs, the points of view, the perspectives that have kept me feeling limited and have kept me from being a profoundly beneficial presence on the planet. Because, see, I had this idea somehow that if I were to acknowledge my own greatness, and what I mean by that is my essential spiritual greatness, which is the truth for all of us, I believed if I tapped into that, somehow I wouldn't be helping the world. I had sort of the opposite program somehow. But what I've discovered, as many of us have discovered, is that when we allow ourselves to deeply know our true nature, not only do we shift the experience of our own reality, but we begin to then shift consciousness on planet Earth. That to me is the Easter story, the resurrection story. Yes, we could say that it's the evolution or the raising of consciousness. A lot of times we talk about consciousness like raising our conscious awareness. And a lot of times in the Easter story, when we hear a metaphysical interpretation, we'll say it's the rising up of consciousness and the birthing of a greater reality. And in the mystical interpretation, and again, a reminder, what I mean by that is my own personal mystical interpretation of this story right now is actually a deepening. It's a reconnecting with, and that's not even true because I was never separate from. So it's actually becoming aware of my oneness with Source is the resurrection story. It is returning to that place of spiritual wholeness, returning to that place of infinite potentiality. So the crucifixion is simply questioning and being curious about all the ideas and experiences that I've had that have kept me from experiencing that essential beingness. And the resurrection story is very simple. I've been searching all of my life for someone or something to help me feel whole again. And all the while, it was always within me. So I can call off the search and rest in this greater reality. This greater reality is profoundly simple. Love is who you are. Source energy is who you are. And knowing that and being that and tuning into that frequency and radiating that love and light is exactly the Easter story. Because Jesus the Christ said this, be in the world, but not of the world. And that is probably one of the most profound spiritual teachings that the earth has ever received. Because so many of us believe that there's something wrong with the world and I need to be part of changing it. And the litmus test with that is, how has that been working? And so what Jesus was saying is to be in the world, not separate ourselves from the world, but not of it. In other words, I don't have to buy into what I hear on the news. I don't have to buy into what I read on social media. I don't have to buy into the stories of lack and limitation and division and better than and less than and war and all the isms that have come from the human ego, and to rest in a greater reality and then be with that in the world. And so what I want to say in closing is the ultimate Easter story and what I see happening on planet Earth as a result of more and more of us waking up is we are shifting from the law of attraction to the law of radiance. That to me is the mystical interpretation of the Easter story. It's radiating that love energy. And because of that, we start to be a part of shifting consciousness on the planet. This is really the only way that consciousness has ever been transformed. And so what was once for a few spiritual masters is now available to each of us. And it's available in this moment, that as we tap into the frequency of our true nature and know very deeply who and what we are, we radiate that into the world. And yes, we are attracted to and we attract situations to vibrate with our frequency, but only 100% of the time. And because of that, we then radiate this out into the world. And then each of us is called to be spiritual masters because we are. It's who and what we are. We simply remember that right here, right now. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And with that, I want to invite us just for a moment to go within, take in a nice, deep, conscious breath. Just allowing ourselves again to tune into the frequency of gratitude, grateful for the exploration of what came through today, grateful for our time together, and mostly grateful to know that there is one power and one presence. This one power and one presence is the truth of who and what we are. This is the Easter story. The Easter story is that we are source energy, that we are love, that we are light. And we simply now go out into the world, into our daily lives, through Zoom, through the phone, through in person, every way we're going to interact today, being this love and being this light. And with great gratitude and knowing that it's already done in the realm of spirit, we simply say yes to this calling to be the love in the world. And so it is. Thank you so much, everyone.